waves that propagated to other countries in the region through disruption of trade, disruption of remittances, a refugee crisis with somewhere around 7 million people moving to neighboring countries, and of course the disruption to commodities and food markets. And what has been quite unprecedented also beyond just the sheer intensity and ferocity of the fighting and the destruction that comes with the war itself has been the wave of sanctions that have been imposed by Western countries on Russia, especially sanctions on trade, but also on financial transactions. Now, 4 months into the war, the picture is quite complex, maybe more complex than we anticipated. Of course, Ukraine has suffered tremendously, and the impact, on the other hand, the impact of the sanctions on Russia has been much more complex to evaluate, and by extension, the impact to the rest of the world. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. Now, most of the sanctions that were initially put in place were on the import side, especially imports of goods that incorporate Western technology, and also financial sanctions. But the sanctions initially did not target Russian energy exports, the main source of revenues. And as a result, Russia has been generating very large trade surpluses in the last few months, both in terms of volume, but also in terms of value, since gas prices are extremely high, and even though Urals sells at a discount to Brent, it's still at a higher level than it was compared to a year ago. Another factor that has been puzzling many observers is the fact that the ruble has appreciated, although if you think for 2 seconds about what I just told you about the fact that Russia runs large trade surpluses, maybe less of a surprise. And in the latest set of sanctions, the European Union set out to implement an embargo on maritime oil coming out of Russia. And this embargo is not due to take place until later this year, and there are also discussions about sanctions on insurance and financing for maritime oil shipments, potentially preventing Russia from selling oil to third countries. So this is a very complex situation. In recent weeks, we've seen Russia, in fact, not the European countries, cutting off gas flows to Europe and raising the stakes. We have very elevated energy and food prices. These markets are integrated. The effects of these disruptions are felt worldwide. High oil and food prices are reducing real income everywhere. There is danger of food insecurity in many parts of the world, possibly social unrest. And the rise in inflation may push many countries through their central bank responses into a much tighter monetary stance and potentially slowing down their economy. So to help us understand this top-of-mind issues, we have two very distinguished panelists with us today. Elena Rybakova is the Deputy Chief Economist at the Institute for International Finance. She has become, in the last few months, for those of you who follow her on Twitter, one of the world experts on Russian sanctions. She's not a stranger to the fund, where she spent many years, and many of you know her, and we're really delighted that she could join us. Robert Areski is also not a stranger to the fund, where he worked for many years, then spent some time as chief economist for the MENA region at the World Bank, and then moved on to be the chief economist at the African Development Bank, and is now a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. So we're really delighted to have them with us today to benefit from their insights on what is a very complex and pressing set of issues. So I'm going to start with Elena, and I will start with a set of easy questions. So can you describe for us the effect of Western sanctions on Russia's economy so far, and the bite that financial sanctions or trade restrictions may have already or maybe in the future? Can sanctions work if they don't target Russia's energy exports? And how realistic or effective would an embargo on Russia's maritime oil exports be? As I said, a set of easy questions to start with. Why don't you take up to 10 minutes to get into this?
Thank you so much. So I will give you an easy answer as well. They're yes and no. So the sanctions, let us not forget that Russia has been under financial sanctions since 2014. And people who do not follow Russia too closely, they must have forgotten about that. At the time, Russian corporates, the biggest borrowers on international capital markets, were cut off from the global capital markets. So at the time, the external debt of Russia went from 700 billion to less than 500 billion just in a matter of 1 year. So since 2014, Russia has been preparing for more financial sanctions. It did some of the measures like alternatives to SWIFT, domestic payments cards for the retailers, requiring Visa and MasterCard to use the domestic payments card system rather than international systems. And they also did some very sensible things. They've done inflation targeting, they've done a fiscal rule, their budget balance is about $40 per barrel, and their current account is also, sort of been prudently used. So therefore, when the first round of sanctions came immediately after the war, those sanctions were mostly focused on the financial sector. In this sort of horrendous game of chess, the Russian central bank played their cards or their game very well. They responded professionally, and here it's a combination, professionalism of the response and preparedness of the existing policy tools. So the fact that there is inflation targeting, the financial system was also cleaned up from over 1,000 banks to just about 400 banks. They've also has a sort of a range of liquidity support instruments that work in a very fragmented emerging market financial system, so they also could use those. At the same time, the immediate policy response was more than doubling of the rate on the day. They've stopped intervening because they were surprised by the fact that their reserves were frozen. They provided emergency liquidity support, and that just to give you magnitude, the Russian financial system did a swing from about 2 trillion rubles surplus vis-a-vis the central bank to almost 8 trillion deficit. So this is, and that's a matter of just a few weeks, days and weeks. Even the largest, the crown jewel of Russia's Sberbank, which accounts for almost half of all deposits and lending, they experienced severe runs in the branches. So they had to keep on shipping the cash to the ATMs and the branches. So, but because of this very shrewd response by the central bank and preparedness, financial sanctions didn't have as much of an impact as many had hoped, including ourselves. So our early forecast for growth contraction was minus 15%, but that was incorporating the effect of a potential financial sector collapse on the economy. So, but the answer is also yes. Why is it yes? And I see some of the trade experts in the room, and I do hope to see more work from them on this topic, because I do think where the pinch is really coming from is from the trade restrictions. And this has two components. One is export controls. And the US system went through the revamping of the export controls after 2018 into a much more broad-range strategic kind of export controls. And some of that was first tried on Huawei in China. And at the same time, European policy is much more limited. It's usually just for military dual-use export controls. However, because of the close cooperation between the US administration and European authorities, they embraced the same export controls as the US, which we can go into secondary sanctions in the questions, which sort of prevented the US from having to force European hand in this respect. So this is one. Another very big factor, and it's almost the private sector is running ahead of the public sector, is self-sanctioning by companies. What we call self-sanctioning is basically either withdrawing their operations and leaving on their balance sheet basically billions of dollars that they will never be able to sell or will have to sell at a very severe discount. What was it, McDonald's? It's tasty, full stop, So that's the Russian alternative. Or also refusing to contribute parts or refusing to contribute means of transportation for, whether it's ships, whether it's planes or containers for Russia. So Yale University has a very good database as well as the Kiev School of Economics. And for example, in the industrial sector of Russia, the direct effect of withdrawal, basically just as a share of assets, 30% is foreign companies. And here we're not even taking into account the parts, we're not taking into account maintenance. Gazprom recently said that they will not be able to, they had to drop their supplies to Europe by 40% because of lack of maintenance by foreign companies providing. So therefore, the financial sanctions, Russia was much better prepared, so it didn't have the same shock and awe effect that many expected. trade sanctions, Russia has integrated into the global economy for 30 years. So to rip that apart, it will be extremely painful.
Thank you, Elena. This is a very good opening for our panel. Let me maybe now turn to Rabat. And Rabat, I understand that you have prepared an initial presentation with some slides, so I'm going to give you the floor and you're going to use that. But maybe let me offer the following questions as sort of a guide for your presentation. This disruption that we've seen in energy and food markets is having a major impact around the world. And there is, of course, a lot of interest in understanding the macro and social impact in emerging markets and developing countries, especially in North Africa and the Middle East. And so if you could tell us a little bit about that, and also tell us how countries have been trying to cope with the consequences of this very rapid rise in those staple prices.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Olivier. So I have a long presentation, but I'll do justice to the 10 minutes max that you allotted me. So very basic structure. I'll talk about the shock, the vulnerability, the consequences, the domestic response, and the international community. All this in 10 minutes. So the Ukraine invasion, as Elena just mentioned, beside the tragic loss of lives, have had a ripple effect on food and energy markets. The blockade of the Black Sea port by the Russian Navy, but also sanction. As Elena mentioned, there are no direct food sanction on food trade, but the payment ban related to SWIFT has indeed made it difficult for this export of Russian export to get by. Of course, there are recent announcements also on the energy front, and these announcements relate to seaborne oil trade, but they are not only they'll be for the next 6 months. But an important aspect of this new sanction on energy relates also to insurance, and there, interestingly, there were some announcements that Russian trading houses in Switzerland are moving to Dubai. This could facilitate some of the trade, including in food and energy. So it's a moving target for sanction. In terms of the effect of this crisis, there are obviously supply disruption for countries that are directly importing from Ukraine or Russia. But there's also the ripple effect from international prices skyrocketing. In addition, the third impact is on the cost of debt on account of the crisis. The countries like Tunisia, Lebanon, Egypt, and others on impact have seen their cost of borrowing double. And so these are some charts to illustrate the unprecedented nature of this crisis. The 2008-2009 crisis and the 2011 food crisis were notorious because they led to a lot of unrest around the world, and now we are really past this threshold, which is alarming. And of course, not all food items have risen in the same way. Oils, vegetable oil that is, cereals, and others have experienced the much dramatic increase. But I must also perhaps warn you that this crisis we may not have seen the worst of that crisis, in a sense that rice prices have so far declined early on and then now slowly increasing. And if there were spillover effect, including because of fertilizer prices that are rising, if rice prices were to increase dramatically, we may see the worst of that crisis soon. Fertilizer prices are, of course, a great source of cost-push inflation in food prices, and this is not auguring well for the next planting season. Energy prices have also skyrocketed, whether it's natural gas or oil, and specifically for refined products, the so-called crack spread has also skyrocketed, explaining also the vast shortages that we see globally, because Russia capacity to export the refined product has also been somewhat taken out of the market, therefore leading to this important rise in prices. In terms of the vulnerability, there is the obvious vulnerability linked to countries that are bilaterally importing from Russia and Ukraine. But as noted, I think by Elena, there are also cascading effects from this crisis, in a sense that countries like Indonesia, India, have also put in place export bans to ensure their food security. As a result, countries that are importing from Indonesia, say for palm oil or wheat from India, are also exposed to shortages. And these cascading effects are alarming. But in terms of the dimension of vulnerability, I'll summarize it by saying that there are three real dimensions of vulnerability. The debt to GDP ratio, the extent to which the country is indebted, the net food import, and net energy import, obviously. And countries like, tragically, like Sri Lanka, who have debt to GDP ratio well above 100%, but which is a country that is also an importer of food and energy, are exposed, and tragically, this has led to unrest and chaos. In terms of the consequences, as Pierre-Olivier just mentioned, there are, of course, large macro impact. The real income effect for countries, say, that would import 30% of GDP of combined energy and food, in the face of a shock of an increase of 60%, would, for instance, experience a 20% real income loss. So these are really macro significant. And this is on top of inflation that was already rapidly rising. For instance, in Africa, inflation was already double-digit in most part of the continent. So, in monetary policy may not be up to the task, not only because it's a supply or external driven inflation, but also because the transmission of monetary policy is weaker. But there are also issues related to competition in developing countries that are not helping the kind of measure that I'll be talking about in a second. There are also, of course, important risk of social unrest related to high food prices. This pertains to the macro implication, as households typically spend over up to 50% of their income in food and energy. And so in terms of the domestic response, countries have used a number of policies, including reduction of taxes, VAT, for instance, on food product, but they've also imposed price controls, which are extremely costly, and others have used targeted cash transfer. And these policies are hard to implement. Even so, targeted cash transfer toward vulnerable segment should be the most appropriate tool. It is hard to target, to identify the appropriate target in many developing countries, and in the face of inelastic demand and oligopolies, may charge a much higher price and may make it difficult. And this relates to the competition issue I've raised earlier. Of course, Other policies included export ban with consequences we just discussed on the spiraling international prices. Other countries have tried to hoard or build stocks of food. This is the case, for instance, here of many countries, but China is a noted country that have increased radically food stock and also put ban on export of fertilizer. So this is alarming, but there are, of course, besides monetary policy and besides fiscal policy, there are lots of supply intervention that can really do good for addressing this crisis. And this is because, for instance, Africa has large amount of uncultivated arable land that it could put to good use and ensure food security. There are, of course, investment in this area, but they are not yet up to the task of feeding the continent. So lots of policy needs to be enacted to attract more of these investment, including issues related to land, but also the issue I mentioned on competition, including in the transport and distribution sector. And as a thought-provoking matter, we typically look at maps of the world where Africa looks tiny, but when you look closely, Africa can comfortably fit the US, China, Europe, and many others. So there is certainly lots of supply intervention that could tap into the enormous potential of the continent, not just in food, but also in energy and other resources. So really, to solve that crisis, supply intervention are key. I'll end by on a note for the international community. Clearly, the IMF, the World Bank have stepped up their support in the face of this series of crises. This should certainly continue while ensuring that this financial assistance reach the very poor and vulnerable segment. But there's also a lot to do, and I know that's something the World Bank and the IMF are focused on, is on the coordination of policy and trying to move away from these export ban. And there's also, of course, a strategic element of the international community response, which should be addressing that debt crisis that's looming, and that certainly will not make the financial assistance effective if countries have to repay private creditor. I know Pierre-Olivier have worked a lot on the topic, so there are ideas related to the invoking of force majeure to try and trigger restructuring or rating holidays in order to extend perhaps the DSSI, that is the debt suspension initiative that has served countries well, but which is now expired. But above all, of course, the international community should step up its effort to bring an end to this conflict and bring peace back to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabat. You managed to pack almost all of it in 10 minutes. Thank you so much for that. Let me go back to Elina here and maybe just rebound on what Rabat just described, which is already an environment that is very adversely affected in terms of food prices and energy prices for a lot of the low-income countries in the world, with very important macro consequences. At the same time, one part of the discussion we haven't had already is, you describe how the sanctions have been mostly on the import side and the financial side, but there are discussions going on right now about implementing sanctions on maritime oil. Russia itself has started to move to curtail the delivery of gas to European markets. Can you tell us how you view these things, how they might impact both Russia and the rest of the world, how likely they are to be effective or not?
Well, Russia cannot weaponize finance because it's a very small and insignificant player in the global finance, but it can weaponize commodities, and that's what it's trying to do. So if we go one by one, when sanctions tend to work is when a country has leverage vis-a-vis the other country. We acknowledge that sanctions are not costless, they bear a cost, but the cost needs to be compared to sometimes military intervention, so relative to that it's cheaper. So where does European Union, EU have leverage vis-a-vis Russia, and where does Russia have leverage the other way around? So if you look at the commodities, oil is the largest share of Russia's exports. Oil and petroleum products are more than 50% of total Russia's exports, and it's also coming close to 40% of budget revenues. So the way that the Russian sort of rentier economy is structured, oil contributes a lot to the centralized federal budget via taxes, and that's why Russian oil production tends to be so effective because, it's taxes, but it is mostly taxed away, most of the profits. So oil is where the international community has leverage, can inflict pain on Russia. If you flip that the other way around, gas is much less important for the budget, is much less important for the export proceeds, and has always generally been used as a geopolitical project. So gas is also mostly distributed to Europe via a link of pipelines. And for some countries, they rely almost 100% of all their gas supplies on Russia. For the EU average, it is about 50% for gas and only 25% for oil. So it is in Russia's interest now that it's finding it hard to spend this extraordinary cash that they're getting from oil and gas revenues, and they got already $100 billion so far this year, the highest ever historically in terms of the current account surpluses. Well, they cannot spend it because nobody wants to sell goods to them. Of course, eventually they'll find ways to circumvent these restrictions, whether it's via other countries or via crypto, but for the time being, this is money useless to them because neither they can really put it at the central bank is sanctioned, nor they can spend it. So they might as well say, you know what, you have it. We're going to disconnect you from gas. We don't need this money. We cannot spend it. So therefore, Russia is incentivized right now to cut off Europe from gas. Has Russia done something similar in the past? What are the indications that maybe geopolitically they would want to do that? Well, Russia has done two energy wars in the past. One was in 2005-2006. Another one is 2008-2009. Those energy wars were aimed at discrediting Ukraine in order to build Nord Stream 2. They were not directly aimed at Europe. But once you have used this tool, it doesn't mean that they're not going to use it against Europe. More recently, we've seen the early signs also of this energy war by Gazprom is, for example, infrastructure in Ukraine. Until recently, all the transit has been going successfully through Ukraine, although the countries are at war, and Russia is paying Ukraine for gas transit while Ukraine is letting Russia do the transit. Well, that is until recently when one of the transit points has been occupied by the Russian army, and Naftogaz said, look, we can no longer control it, we cannot use this for transit. Gazprom said, what's your problem? So now you see already there are some reductions in terms of the Gazprom's ability or willingness to sell gas. And more recently, Gazprom said, look, foreign companies are not maintaining our equipment, and we have to drop flows to Europe by 40% because, no equipment, no flows. So I think it is more, again, the indication that Gazprom is willing to pursue these energy wars. On the oil front, and we can talk much more, I think for now, the biggest risk is the commodity price spike, and we have seen that already. The fact that it takes a long time to get to the unanimous process in the EU is challenging. And we've already seen Borrell make comments that, look, if there is any enlargement of the EU, we might have to go not with consensus, but with majority voting, because these are very difficult situations. But what needs to happen is tightening directly via sanctions seaborne Russian oil, and at the same time, if that fails, reverting to the US secondary sanctions on other countries. But of course, for that, global economy, countries against the war might have to face potentially much higher oil prices. And, just to conclude, Russia's investment into, again, a geopolitical project, which is OPEC+, appears to be paying off. And, if there are questions, I'm happy to elaborate on that. I think it is much overlooked, Russia's investment in the relationship with Saudi that started happening from 2016 onwards. When right now, then OPEC+ says, you know what, especially the swing producers, we're going to wait a little. There's Saudi, there's UAE, who can actually ramp up production. And so far, they haven't been really jumping on the US's request to produce more.
Thank you, Elena. But let me turn it back to you, and then we'll take a first round of questions from the audience, maybe. But the list of the impacts on low-income countries is from the current situation is pretty long and pretty sobering. This is on top of a pandemic that has hit all countries in the world, but especially so the low-income countries. We at the fund, we have estimated that the pandemic itself will generate quite a bit of scarring in low-income countries that are not expected to return back to their pre-pandemic levels of economic activity until much later than advanced economies. And so I guess the question I would have for you is, do you see the war in Ukraine and the consequences it may have as another factor that could lead to additional scarring, or is it more nuanced because some countries may, in terms of their overall GDP numbers, for instance, energy producers might be benefiting from some of the current environment, while others might be hurt? How do you view this?
No, thank you very much. To be brief, I'll just say that there is there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the good is the Saudis and of this world, the Gulf countries, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, that have a smaller population but are washed with oil, which price is skyrocketing. That's the good. The bad is the countries that have either exporters of food, like South Africa, or exporter of energy, like Nigeria, who are populous and which benefit on the export side is mitigated, is reduced by heavy bill on either energy or on the food import side. And the ugly are countries that are like the Sri Lanka and others that are indebted, both food and energy importer. And of course, in the list of countries where things get really ugly are the fragile country, the conflict country, Yemen, Afghanistan, and others that are already on the brink of total collapse. So there it gets really ugly.
Thank you. So let me now maybe open it up for questions. I'm sure many of you have things that you may want to ask our panelists here in terms of the sanctions, how they might play out going forward, the oil markets. I see Andrea has a hand up here in the front.
I have thanks to the three of you for the first insight, very, very, very useful. I think I have a question more maybe for Elena, but for all the others as well, on sanctions. Looking forward, I guess I had this impression at the very beginning, clearly there have been a lot of political democratic support in favor of Ukraine and for sanctions. And I wonder, like with the war dragging and, getting longer and longer, and economic situation in Europe especially getting worse for reasons which are also unrelated to the war, and inflation going up and that. What do you think about the sort of political support for keep on having sanctions going to be in the next few months in the winter time?
Let me see if there is another question. Georges.
Very interesting discussions. So I guess one of the things I'm worried about the sanctions is that we don't fully understand what could happen. And so I kind of go back to when the U.S. embargoed oil on Japan. No one thought that would end up with Pearl Harbor. And, the types of costs that we incurred as a world. And so I think some of the discussions of how destabilizing these sanctions are, I just don't know how much we're thinking about these risks and what could happen next. And I don't know if you have some insights into those risks. These are really unknowable risks, but I think they're important things that we need to be thinking about. And history tells us that some things do happen that we don't foresee. So.
Yeah, I wanted to just get to even the title of the panel, War and Sanctions. One argument that one often hears, especially here in the region, is that it's actually the sanctions and not the war that is causing all these food price shortages, these food shortages and the price spikes. Can you disentangle that, please? Thank you.
Let me just take those three. We'll do another round. So keep your questions, and we'll come back to that. Let me actually expand on what both George and Christophe were asking, and bring in the question of geo-economic fragmentation that is, I think, in the back of George's question. I mean, that's one particular way that things could go from bad to worse. But also the question of the sort of the nuances of the PR argument on sanctions versus war is also about that. It's about sort of splitting and gaining alliances or gaining support. So do you view, and I guess I will ask both of you in turn, I will start with you, Elina, do you view the current juncture as one where the world economy could bifurcate into something that is much more adversarial, maybe going all the way to different blocks or opponents at least on the economic front, potentially on other fronts as well? Is that something? I mean, we've seen, for instance, various moves by Russia to try to disengage even more from any, you mentioned some of them, from the sort of the dollar orbit. We've seen other countries that have been sympathetic to that as well. So how do you view the play of the forces at the current moment?
Thank you. I saw the IMF publication was fragmentation there, and I think it exactly sets the theme. There is already happening fragmentation globally. There are countries like India, China, South Africa, Brazil to an extent that just don't want to have none of this. South Africa would like to get Russian fertilizers and appears to be making a deal. India used to import less than 2% of oil from Russia, partially, their refineries constraints, but they want to double that, those imports at a discount. China is already importing at a max capacity and putting some of Russian oil into their strategic reserves. So that kind of global fragmentation has already happened, and Yellen was her comments of friendshoring. I think that's sort of almost solidified, and the response also from the other side at the BRICS summit was that Chinese are extremely annoyed at the weaponization of finance. I think that was also not in no uncertain terms was expressed also during spring meetings by the Chinese authorities. But the fragmentation I'm particularly worried about, and what's also Andrea alluded to, is within Europe. I think the court is for now in European, with Europeans, the ball is with Europeans at the moment. And I think if Europe chooses to respond as a fragmented power to this connection, then some countries might have enough supplies in their stockpiles of gas for the winter, 180 days for some, Austria I think. Others have almost nothing. And if the winter comes and they get disconnected and there is no mechanism for them to share those supplies or come together to the global LNG market to get alternatives, as a big market, as big single market, well, then we'll have a problem. And I am worried that it might happen. European institutions have the sort of the EU energy platform, which was suggested some years ago. It became a little bit more effective or functional with the COVID vaccine purchases. Let's see if that can be made functional properly for this winter. The only thing is, it's a little bit easier for European politicians because if Russia disconnects them, they will be forced to do something. So rather than them having to volunteer that. In terms of do we understand sanctions? No, we don't. I mean, and when we first wrote about European economic sovereignty at Bruegel, I had to go back to almost rant publications to what is the definition of sovereignty. It was such an outdated literature, nobody was talking about it before Macron and others started talking about European puissance and sovereignty. And there is something similar feeling of this economic statecraft, how it feels into our macroeconomic models, but I think also as Jake Sullivan said, well, economists should also learn from foreign policy experts. How does it feel with our national security objectives, with our foreign policy objectives? There isn't a model at all that tells me if I tweak here something on the sanctions, this is the desired objective and this is the desired outcome. Am I achieving it? And just like in early days of inflation targeting, there seems to be destructive ambiguity, even communicating about those objectives. So I think for researchers in the room, I think this is an absolutely critical multidisciplinary area to be working on so we don't end up with the crisis. And as somebody said to me, you know, from very knowledgeable person, he said, well, if they take our foreign reserves that are currently frozen and they appropriate them, there is a high risk of nuclear war. Are we thinking about that? You know, that is a very important risk. And then just finally, whether, what is it? I'll try to make a polite joke. Whether, what is it?
Sanctions.
I'll try not, okay, whether war causes food crisis or sanctions. Well, you know, whether the guns or they're going to cause something. So anyway, so on the war front, you know, Ukraine used to export close to 90% of all their total exports via 4 ports. That's it. There is no infrastructure to do it otherwise. And the fact that Russia, from the early days of the war, attacked those ports, to me, is a clear indication that it's an attempted disruption of supply.
Abba, let me turn it to you.
Thank you. No, in terms of absolutely, in terms of the worst case scenario, indeed, you know, it's all I think on our mind. The nuclear escalation is clearly one of such extreme cases. When it concerns developing countries, really, and I alluded to that. You know, protests, civil unrest are obviously. And contagious one are very much, I think, on my mind as well. Also considering prices are way higher than they were in 2011, 2008, and as I alluded to, also rise prices may be the next flashing point. In terms of economic fragmentation, I think the fund has you know, launched a great discussion, debate on the issue, but I worry more about the geopolitical. I mean, the economic is underpinned by geopolitics, but I worry that the West is 2/3 of GDP, 1/3 of the population, and that 2/3, the rest of the population, the 2/3, are indeed, for the most part, believing that indeed it is sanctions that are, you know, driving all this chaos, and there is a battle of health and mind that one needs to win to avoid that the whole world basculate into some kind of sort of a populism. So there, I worry that we may not come back from that, and you know, Putin has stated very clearly that he's going to use food and energy as weapon, and it seems to be working. So we've got to ramp up on the geopolitical front, and the UN votes against Russia really are a warning sign for the West.
Thank you, Abba. So let's go to the second round. I see that there were a lot of hands over there. So Prachi first, and maybe Ratna, and then we have a third question in the back.
I was just wondering if Elena or Rabah could speak a little bit about, you know, what implications could the freezing of FX reserves, and not only, you know, dollar reserves were frozen, you know, all currency reserves were frozen. What would it imply for the demand for dollar more generally in the global economy? And also, what does it imply for, you know, reserve management policies of EMs like India, China, etc., if you could comment on that. Thank you very much.
Ratna?
Yeah, so I'm going to ask a provocative question. Everybody's worried about economic fragmentation. And I want to ask the question, you know, recently we read that Putin said, at least, that Russia was developing an alternative mechanisms for international financial settlements with the BRICS. So to me, it sounds like a good idea. Why should SWIFT or one particular currency in the world dominate? It's good to have competition. What's wrong with that? Why is that called fragmentation? I think it's good to develop alternative ways in which you know, there can be financial exchanges across countries. So I'd like to hear all of your views, including yours, Pierre-Olivier.
So my question is also forward-looking, much like Andres, but Andres was on politics. Mine is more on the Russian economy, maybe for Elaine. Like, so you mentioned these economic sanctions, or you call them trade sanctions in parts, and we know anecdotal, like, planes and oil sector lost the service operators, and tanks even can't be produced, et cetera. I mean, how do you see the Russian economy if this continues? Will they be able to adjust? And what's going to be the efficiency of their economy without these elements?
I'll take one more question. There was one in the back over there. Go ahead, sir.
Merci. Est-ce que je peux m'exprimer en français parce qu'il y a assez de termes qui m'échappent en langue anglaise? I prefer to speak French. Alors, ma question principale, c'est est-ce que vous ne voyez pas que, je dirais, le monde occidental a sous-estimé la capacité de la Russie à gérer cette crise en utilisant toutes les cartes géopolitiques, avec la Chine, avec l'Inde, avec ça a été dit avec la dame qui a fait la présentation, la responsable, la patronne de la Banque centrale russe a bien joué le jeu, a réussi la gestion de la crise. Et ça coïncide. En même temps, on a des effets maintenant en termes d'inflation, et on sait très bien que l'inflation, c'est un mal public. Et dès qu'on touche à l'inflation, on touche je dirais, la poche du citoyen. Et comme conséquence immédiate, c'est la montée de la droite, des partis populaires, de la gauche, l'extrême gauche. Et on sait très bien, ce sont des partis qui sont plutôt pro-russes que pro-occidentaux. Et ce qui fait, c'est, je dirais, on va déjà un effritement un petit peu de cette alliance contre la Russie. Je ne suis pas là pour défendre la Russie, mais pour dire, attention, on est dans un système capitaliste qui vit, qui se reproduit et qui dure principalement dans un moment de paix, avec une mondialisation. Le système en lui-même, sa force, c'est d'innover, de sortir de ces crises, c'est exporter, c'est vendre. Or, avec cette crise, c'est l'inflation, c'est l'instabilité, c'est tous les problèmes du monde. Et là, est-ce qu'on ne peut pas dire que, comme je l'ai dit, est-ce qu'il n'y avait pas une sous-estimation des capacités russes? Est-ce que par là, on ne voit pas que les Occidentaux, et principalement les Américains, ils risquent de perdre le contrôle de ce système et l'installation de plus en plus d'un monde multipolaire avec le dollar, avec le yuan, avec 3 ou 4 monnaies internationales, je dirais avec même ce qu'a dit la dame, avec 2 ou 3 systèmes internationaux en matière d'échange. Alors du moment qu'on va perdre ça, on va essayer de faire tout, à la limite on va brûler tout le monde. L'essentiel c'est de garder ce monopole. Et par là je reviens à ma question principale, est-ce que vous ne voyez pas que les Occidentaux se sont trompés? Ils croyaient que c'était un petit pays sur lequel on va faire des petites sanctions et en 2-3 mois, on revient à l'ordre préféré par les Occidentaux, et merci.
So we have a set of heavy questions are getting heavier and heavier. So let me start with you, Elina.
Maybe I'll start with Ratna's question on the sort of asymmetrical interdependence weaponized. I think there was a paper a while back. And there are arguments made that exactly more dispersed systems are harder to weaponize and potentially they're more stable rather than the centralized nodes that the US is holding now. I still think it's probably going to take time, and I think it goes to Pracha's question with freezing of reserves. We've had a lot of questions during spring meetings, particularly about what do we do. And I think for the problem is there's no alternative, because this time around Europeans participated with the US and are very much aligned, and the freezing of the reserves happened together at the same time. As you know, Russian Central Bank completely did not expect this measure. They did expect some measures on the US treasuries, and that's why they divested from the US treasuries in 2018, but they completely did not expect the freezing of the reserve assets, precisely because of the concerns for the global financial architecture and the dollar. And I think that's why the thinking that it would be easy or fast to get the national, sort of to take over ownership of Russian reserves and pass them on to Ukraine, I think that's a very naive thinking, you know, precisely because of the concerns for the role of the dollar and as the global reserve currency, and the legal challenges that might emerge from that, of having to prove that this specific reserve somehow relate to this specific activity. It will be very challenging from the legal point of view. On the Russian economy to adjust, I think it's a fantastic question, especially that since we're at war, and as Putin said, sanctions are an act of war, you cannot really talk directly to Russian authorities about it, can you? So I think the work of everybody from the outside has become so much more challenging. In terms of the adjustment, we have seen domestic surveys. You know, domestic industrialists have done a survey where 86% of companies have been affected by sanctions directly, exports and imports, and they try to break them down how. We've seen the Central Bank of Russia has done a fantastic survey, and they're going to soon do an update of the more than 13,000 enterprises, region by region, industry by industry, and then a type of effect from sanctions by type of effect. So it's a sort of, it's a big matrix. And so we know, and their conclusion, and Governor Nabulina was in Duma saying that it will take vibrant, free, private sector and rule of law to be able to adjust to this new transformation. So she actually said that in Duma, of what I call sort of reverse industrial transformation. Well, it didn't exist in Russia for the last 30 years. After the further tightening of authoritarian, almost totalitarian regime, I don't see that emerging soon either. However, you know, in a year and a half, 3 years, we'll likely will see some retooling. The fact that the financial system didn't collapse, it will help them finance some of that retooling. They will need the credit. And of course, there's more the incentive for them to find ways to use the dollars that they're accumulating via other ways, you know, whether it's settlement in other ways, or swaps, or you know, or this unfortunate virtual assets, you know, volatile, but still.
About.
Thank you. So on the question on reserve allocation, I would say I'd turn back the question and say that it would be difficult to find assets where this reserve, this investment would go to with the kind of depth, you know, deep market. So I think that would prevent a lot of the disinvestment. On the fragmentation of currency, I'll probably leave Pierre-Olivier to respond to that, but I think the other reserve currency would have to be underpinned by rule of law and things of that nature. So I think we wish there'll be more, you know, countries that would satisfy perhaps the standard that the US has set on that front. I think on the question regarding the inflation as a regressive phenomenon, absolutely, and I think we repeatedly talked about the risk of social unrest, but there I would also talk about the silver lining for policies, including structural policies for the continent. There are lots of opportunities for the continent to enact the right policies and ensure food security. So while this is a tragic situation, it has highlighted the importance, I think, for many countries to address these structural issues. And the other thing I would point to is we've seen many countries, and I think the IMF chart I showed point to that. Lots of countries are cutting taxes, including the US, and we know this is not really working. I mean, this is not going to have a pass-through on prices, yet countries around the world keep doing this. And so I would insist that the IMF, but all governments around the world, be very much more coherent and look for complementarity between these policies rather than throwing whatever they can to the problem. And the reason why this is important is this is a crisis that is likely to last, to be persistent. So there's issues of viabilities of these policies, issues of complementarity. We need to get at these structural policies that have created these vulnerability to start with.
So I'll add a few things to address maybe Ratna's question and that of the gentleman in the back here. So one way to look at things, and by the way, as an aside, on these issues of fragmentation, there is a very interesting issue of finance and development. There were copies out there. You can find it online. I highly recommend that you have a look at it. A number of different pieces there on the topic. The question that is the paradox to me is the following. Obviously, we are witnessing the rise of emerging markets, and they are now a big part of the global economy. And in a sense, we have a global economic order that was built on the previous generation of previous version of the world. So some adjustment will happen. It has to happen. It will happen. And in part, this rise in emerging markets was also fueled by the kind of multilateral environment that was put in place by the institutions we currently have. It was designed to deliver that, and it delivered it. And now it reaches the point where it is being challenged. And so this is the transition that needs to happen. It's the difficult transition that is not easy to implement, precisely because it goes beyond the economics. It has to do with strategies. It has to do with geopolitical issues. But it is imperative that it succeeds. And in that context, this is the sense in which I also think that, yes, to some extent, maybe Russia was underestimated in its capacity to resist and be resilient to various forms of sanction, or even to instigate, try to instigate various forms of change. And clearly, they were, to some extent, this was carefully planned, even though some of the responses from the West, like the freezing of central bank reserves, I think was really a surprise. So finding a way to implement something that will be truly multipolar, where there will be different centers of gravity in the world, this is where we're headed, and this is a challenge ahead of us. The current situation is not exactly inspiring optimism. The forces at play, the centripetal fugal forces are stronger than the opposite, and we're seeing sort of different parts of the world moving aside. To me, when we think about have we underestimated Russia, what really strikes me is some of the discussions that were taking place in many European countries up until very recently, very active academic debates even on whether the European countries themselves should be the ones stopping their gas purchases from Russia, thinking that somehow this was what it was going to be, having some impact on Russia. And I think, as Elena very lucidly presented to us, it worked the other way. Russia is the country that is actually cutting the gas to the European countries, and European countries are trying to find ways to cope with that. So that's one example. But it doesn't mean that the Western countries are not careful about the economic implications of the decisions they're taking. And here, and maybe I will turn back to Elena with this, I think there have been discussions of ways in which, for instance, sanctions could be imposed while preserving the supply of oil to the markets or the supply of gas to the market. I'm sort of curious, what, as an expert on these questions, what your views might be on these things. There are discussions of having a cartel of buyers, for instance, or of using tariffs as a. So, what is your analysis on these questions?
I have to here agree with a number of papers that propose the tariffs and sort of like a common purchasing framework from the EU. I think as an economist, it's a fantastic idea. It makes all the economic sense. Unfortunately, politicians disagree. When prices are high, they do not want to say that, oh, we're the ones adding to the even higher prices that the population sees visually. And even in the US, we've seen quite the opposite action taken, although, it's not related directly to Russia, but it's partially related to the upcoming elections and high commodity prices and high gas prices. So yes, yes, so I think the tariffs and common EU energy purchase framework would be ideal world, the first best solution, but unfortunately we live in the second best solution world, or even the third or fourth. We also want to set it in a broader framework. European Union with the Green Deal, which is fantastic, has gone to the market to many traditional suppliers of gas, for example, Algeria and others, and said, look, 10 years from now we will not need you. So then those suppliers said, you know what, here you have the spot contract. It's very volatile and expensive, but you don't need us, you know, so why should we make, you know, long-term relationship with you? And instead they turned around to China, and China now has agreements to invest in Algerian infrastructure in order to be able to have those long-term agreements. So the Russian conflict is also timed, quote-unquote, for Russia at the right time, when the gas prices were already coming higher. Europe became more reliable on the short-term sort of spot prices. And then, of course, on top of that, we're having the high shock. So I think for European energy security, the cost will be permanently higher and it will weigh on growth. And we were discussing here, the ECB was you and the colleagues, and what do you do in this environment? That you might be in a situation like in the global financial crisis, where you hike, and then you just turn around and realize the economy is disintegrating.
Thank you. Let me turn it back to the floor if there are any more questions. Antonio in the front row here. The gentleman there.
Hello. It seems that Europe is overambitious in its own goals. It wants to punish Russia, to have a green transition, to have cheap energy, and to have a role of leadership in the international monetary system. Something has to give in these four objectives, especially if you have little capital, political capital, and economic capital. Which ones, in your opinion, of these four objectives you think that the Europeans are happier to live or to prioritize?
In Raba's presentation, he talked about how controlled prices were affecting deficits in emerging economies. So they, in order to stop, because prices of food and commodities have risen so much, but they're often controlled by the government, it's creating deficit problems. So just think of an analogy in terms of FX intervention. You know, I think the thing we think now is like to be the things you can't stop you can't change the end point, but you want to smooth the transition to the end point. I mean, do you have some framework with which to think about how that may help policymakers think about the trade-offs they face in terms of adjusting to this new normal? I mean, assuming that commodity prices are going to stay high for some time.
For the sake of variety, maybe we'll start with you, Rabah, this time.
Yeah, I'm not sure I got so the question was related to price control and how Sure. Yeah. No. So the classic issue is indeed to try and do the targeting. So let the price pass through from international to domestic prices, and then target the poor. But as I mentioned, that has proven difficult also to identify who the poor are. But I do understand that certain countries have opted for this universal type of subsidy as a blanket policy to avoid the kind of unrest or social tension. So from a politics standpoint, while as economists we're really opposed to this type of universal subsidy / price control, in the face of such fragile circumstances, indeed. One can really understand why this has been put in place. But if you allow me, I would also want to say something about this energy transition. Indeed, this is a very peculiar time also to have to handle such energy shock, because indeed this might be the last oil price super cycle, and Europe is faced with this difficult balancing act between ensuring energy security, so therefore investing in gas, and we've seen a number of announcements around investment, large investment in Qatar, in Africa, and doing that transition, I think as Antonio mentioned. This is peculiar because indeed this might be the last oil price super cycle, and we've seen investment in the oil sector and gas sector decline since 2014, and that explains why also the price is so high, putting aside the current circumstances. So very difficult, and that's where I think this friend-shoring strategy would work. There's plenty of natural gas to be found in the continent. There's plenty of investment in renewable to do in the continent. So as I showed in the map, this is a vast continent with lots of opportunities. So I think the energy security of Europe and the transition that Europe is calling for would have to be found in that kind of mutually advantageous relationship with Africa, and I think fine-tuning that is going to be key. But of course, there are other forces that are going against this rapprochement between Europe and Africa.
No.
Well, I think we're at the same moment for European Union as we were in the global financial crisis and sovereign debt crisis. I think just many people haven't quite realized that we are in that moment. And just like at the time, some of the European institutions were not prepared to deal with the sovereign debt crisis, European energy infrastructure decision-making is not prepared. And we have fantastic people in the European Commission Energy, and they're working very hard, but there are few. And the decision-making process in Europe is not yet geared towards common decision on energy policy. So I think the cheap energy is out of the window already. It's not that they can pursue an objective, they can pursue unicorns, but it's not gonna happen. I think here US is also playing a very big role, as well as, of course, private sector in US and in Europe. And we talked earlier about subsidization. I had an honor to speak to about 40 executive board directors on top energy companies in the US. And none of them was jumping to invest tomorrow. They were just asking questions, how serious are Europeans? So this is multi-billion projects, either regasification or the increasing production or shipment to Europe. There are not enough ships, It's a huge multi-billion investment to just do one thing. The same thing in Europe. Germany is, by the way, hoping to finish 2 terminals, LNG terminals, by the end of the year. But again, they will need somebody to ship it to them. So I think we are just in the very beginning of the very long and treacherous path, and we'll be talking about energy security for many years.
Thank you. I would add to that. I think it's very clear that, as Elena said, that Antonio is right. If the intersection of the constraints is the empty set, something has to give. And so far, we've seen very clearly that the willingness to stay on course for the green transition is the one that is giving up. The Repower EU measures that were announced 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago actually allow for increased coal emissions by the European Union, and increased in the production of energy by burning coal, which is, of course, going completely in the wrong direction. Now, one might say this is an integral constraint. The climate transition is not a point by point, it's an integral constraint, but then immediately it brings the question of credibility. And so we have this tension where we have announced that we want to move towards green transition, and this is already having an effect on investment in carbon-based production technologies, as Elena described, whether it's negotiations with the Algerians on natural gas, or whether it's in development of new capacity. But we also need credibility on the green path in order to generate the transition and the investment in the renewables, and the investors in the renewable sector don't necessarily see the commitment there. So we're sort of in the worst of both worlds, where there is a decline in investment and capacity in the traditional energy source, but there is not yet a ramp up in the alternative. And of course, that creates a situation where you have volatility in energy, and volatility in energy itself is something that might undermine the transition path. Let me see if there are any final rounds of questions. I see we're closing in on our allotted time. Yes, please, over there.
Thank for you. I have a question. I can't speak very fluently English, but I do it. The Black Sea War has its share of content for emerging countries like Morocco, but it's not also a source of export opportunity for natural resource like natural gas, rare metals and phosphate for Europe. It's not opportunity for the emerging country like Morocco.
Maybe you can repeat the question without the mic. We'll understand better. Sorry.
The actual war in between Russia and Ukraine have a lot of create a lot of problem for emerging country like Morocco. But in the same time, I think that it's an opportunity for this country for export natural resources like gas, phosphate, and metal. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, indeed, as I mentioned earlier, there are, lots of opportunities for the Nigeria, for the South Africa, for the Morocco of this world that are powerhouses in terms of agriculture. But of course, this for Morocco, it would come at the cost of higher energy prices. So the benefit on the export side is diminished by the import bill that's rising. So yes, while there are opportunities, there are also the other side of the vulnerability on the import front. And in general, for Africa, indeed, some of the countries that are benefiting from this bonanza, from the windfall of higher prices, the exporters, they should trade carefully and indeed try and complement this windfall with appropriate governance, so they could make the most out of this opportunity, so to speak.
Okay, well, if we don't have any more questions, so maybe I will close this session unless you have some final words you'd like to share, or no? So please join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists. I think they did a fantastic job. I want also to second the call that was made to do more research on these questions. I mean, it was quite striking at the onset of the pandemic how quickly the academic profession, economists, jumped on the opportunity to try to understand better the impact of lockdowns and infections and on economic activity that were not part of our regular suite of models. It's quite remarkable when you look at the quantity of work and the quality of the work that has been done. And in a similar way, I think that there is a sort of a call to research on the topics of whether it's sanctions, whether it's fragmentation, whether it's the sort of the geopolitical implications and of the environment we're in. And I certainly hope that we will see a lot more work in these areas going forward. Thank you very much.